Hello, fellow bookish people. I've pressed record without really even thinking what I'm going to say. I'm going to talk about The Hitch Hiker's Guide to the Galaxy because I was in the need of a comfort read. So I picked up this, the very first in a very inaccurately described trilogy of books by Douglas Adams, science fiction. This one first published in 1979, based on a radio play that was first released into the airwaves in like 1978. Follows Arthur Dent, a hapless Englishman who has a really bad day. I think it's a really bad Tuesday because you can never get a hand on Tuesdays. I think it's Tuesdays or is it Thursdays? Oh, now I can't remember. Maybe it's a Wednesday. Ooh. We're not going to get into bogged down by the details in this review, this comfort read. Anyways, it's a bad day because his house gets bulldozed and the Earth gets destroyed by a Vogon constructor fleet, which has has destroyed it due to make room for a hyperspace bypass, which throughout what you find out not too far into the novel has actually become a redundant thing and didn't need to actually happen in the first place. So yes, I'd like to talk about this book. It's often called a funny book, and it is a funny book, but I would like to focus on some of the other aspects, I think, of the book that have at least helped it last in my view, in my world. And maybe I'm just projecting stuff in here. Maybe it's because I kind of come to this for comfort that I think about Douglas Adams' atheism, and I just think about sadness when I read this very funny book, or what I find is very funny. If you're into British humor, if you're into Monty Python, if you were a teenager in the 1980s, this is all stuff that probably really is up your alley, and I'll leave it to you to discover if it is not. I was watching Daryl over at his channel, Hype Word, talk about this book, and saying that, while the characters aren't like these rich three-dimensional deep literary characters, that the book has that very rare thing, the thing that I think really propels authors from being really great writers to being people who just resonate throughout a culture, of having a great voice. The narrative voice of this book is probably the chief character, the chief appeal. This kind of wistful, thoughtful, very very British, very playful voice that Douglas Adams is able to project. This is a book series that I, dating myself, I had the books on tape version of this narrated by Douglas Adams from Dove Audio. All like 4 or 5 of them, or 6 of them at the time, of this inaccurately named trilogy, and Douglas Adams reading it. You really got the sense of his voice, and you get that even without it. This time, I did this sans audio in my usual lazy ways. I actually sat down and just sort of read this book, and you could really hear Douglas Adams' voice. It's a book where, as I say, I talk about sadness and atheism in this book. Which isn't to say that, if you're an atheist, you're going to be a sad person or something like that. Much to the contrary. You especially with someone like Douglas Adams, you can see through this book and others that he had a very lively interest in like the wonders of this world that just simply didn't have a teleological kind of higher being behind it all, that there was finding all the great wonder meaning in this universe without that, and indeed kind of creating your own meaning. And it's a book that starts off with the hero's house getting destroyed, with the very planet getting destroyed, and it's like how insignificant the planet Earth is in the just great general scheme of things. Indeed, it's in one of the later books. We have the the total perspective vortex, which is a terrible machine to be fed in the middle of to find out your vanishingly small significance on a universal scale, which is something that, you can see someone coming from maybe an atheistic point of view kind of coming up with. And being very funny of exactly how the poor hapless being that gets tossed into that defeats that. But that's for another review. But yeah, just like there's also just a sort of a thing in this book of the characters in this book do kind of come off as sad. Starting off primarily with Arthur Dent. He's somebody who lives alone, who doesn't seem to really have those connections. And indeed, there's a point in the book early on in the book where he's informed, like, the earth is being destroyed. And this is how it goes. There was no way his imagination could feel the impact of the whole earth having gone. It was too big. He prodded his feelings by thinking that his parents and his sister had gone. No reaction. He thought of all the people he'd been close to. No reaction. He then thought of a complete stranger he'd been standing behind in the queue at the supermarket 2 days before, and felt a sudden stab. The supermarket was gone. Everyone in it was gone. Nelson's column had gone. Nelson's column had gone, and there would be no outcry because there was no one left to make an outcry. And going on further, every Bogart movie has been wiped, he said to himself, and that gave him a nasty knock. McDonald's, he thought. There was no longer any such thing as a McDonald's hamburger. He passed out. When he came round a second later, he found he was sobbing for his mother, which, it's funny how that kind of the workaround of like, I feel, he feels nothing for his parents having gone or his sister having gone. And he has to kind of go through all these kind of things and then just material things like the movies or a McDonald's hamburger and that just shaking his world and then waking up to the fact and sobbing for his mother. Does a really good job of sort of a good portrayal, even though it's not like psychologically deep, of just like, being a very kind of isolated member of this, where like it's quite possible that your most significant interaction with another human being in the last week has been with a complete stranger who you were standing behind in a supermarket line going, hurry up. It's like, that kind of a sadness, that kind of an isolation, I think, is something that kind of reoccurs with a lot of the characters in this book. Poor Arthur Dent getting kind of ricocheted back and forth, and having to try and kind of cope with this just absurd world and to kind of make up his own stuff. And I mean, he just gets invited along on this travel by someone who he thought was a friend, but turned out to be an alien from a small planet near Betelgeuse, Arthur Dent. And indeed, not Arthur Dent, Ford Prefect, his friend Ford Prefect, who'd been posing as an out-of-work actor. But, it's that sort of like, well, come along with me and we'll have some fun. It's like that sort of in some ways that sums up, life. Let's come along and let's try and have some fun. Let's try and invest our own meaning in it. Now, this is a book. It's interesting, his narrative style, his narrative tricks, the ways that Douglas Adams uses what's very light science fiction, but when he does use his science fiction, it is stuff for like narrative purposes. Stuff like, well, I'm trying to introduce this world to A, Arthur Dent, and B, to you, the reader. Okay, well, we'll have a very useful little book that's, sometimes apocryphal, often inaccurate, but, you can carry it around in a handy little case and has the friendly words "Don't panic" on the front of it. That's the Hitch Hiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And you'll get these little narrative snippets, which are little kind of funny essays on stuff like Vogons and Vogon poetry and how Vogon poetry is I believe the third worst poetry in the universe. The second one being some guy whose basically intestines came up and strangled him, and the first worst being, of course, some woman who lived in England and just his poetry was god awful. And I often wonder is that a real lady that that Douglas Adams has inserted her name in there just to make horrible fun of her about how terrible her poetry was, but. So we have this narrative device of the Hitch Hiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And the other major narrative device, the one indeed that powers like all of these books, is the infinite improbability drive, the very drive that has actually caused the hyperspace bypass that that caused the destruction of the Earth to become irrelevant. And it is a drive which basically carries the ship through every single point in the universe instantaneously. However, it also makes the completely improbable almost virtually certain. So if you get tossed out an airlock, it's infinitely impossible that you're actually going to get picked up by a passing spaceship. However, in this little pocket universe, it's this infinite improbability drive, which is, it's almost like it's like a little miracle machine put into a book, a comedic book by an atheist author, and makes for just super absurdity. This is, to steal a phrase from Dante, a divine comedy, except it's a secular comedy where, life is meaningless and terrible, but at least you can kind of laugh at it at the same time. Or at least we can laugh at it. Poor Arthur Dent is quite horrified and is looking for a good cup of tea throughout the book. And I mean, it's one of these books where you see things in it and you go, oh God, this actually is really commenting on the world. Now the infinite improbability drive powers the Heart of Gold, which has been stolen by Zaphod Beeblebrox, and indeed he gets himself elected president of the universe just to be there at the launch of the Heart of Gold, so he can steal it. And what is said is, it was for the sake of this day, the launch of the Heart of Gold, that he, Zaphod Beeblebrox, had first decided to run for the presidency, a decision that had sent shockwaves of astonishment throughout the Imperial Galaxy. Zaphod Beeblebrox? President? Not the Zaphod Beeblebrox, not the president. Many had seen it as clinching proof that the whole of known creation had finally gone bananas. And Zaphod Beeblebrox, adventurer, ex-hippie, good-timer, crook, quite possibly, manic self-publicist, terribly bad at personal relationships, often thought to be completely out to lunch. It's predicting Trump. It's talking about people like Trump, and indeed, when the narrative starts talking about what made Zaphod Beeblebrox basically a shoo-in to become president of not the United States, that's occupied by a different possible crook. It was positively like almost a certainty that he was going to get in, and you'll have to read the book to find out. To steal Alan Morton, you'll have to read the book to find out why it was virtually a complete clincher that he was going to get in to become president. So yes, it's a funny book, but I would encourage you, if you're reading it, to see the sadness in it and to see how this is definitely a book written by someone who says you've got to make your own meaning in the world. That absurd bad things are going to happen, but we've got this, and we need to use that to try and make it a better place for ourselves and for others. At least that's I get that strong, humane feeling from all of the horrible, terrible things that Douglas Adams has to happen to poor Arthur Dent. And as an Arthur Dent myself, who was feeling very dented, it was a delight to go back to and read that. So, maybe it's something that would appeal to you. Maybe it's just a nostalgia trip for this geezer looking back at the 80s. And I don't even have my digital watch on, because it is a really good idea to have a digital watch. All right, I'm a prude who knows where his towel is, so I'm going to head off now. More videos later.